Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss the music of Christendom by Susan Treacy. We're moving on to Chapter 19, Romantic Italian Opera. However, Joseph Pierce would like to make a comment on something that occurred previously. So, Joseph, it's all yours.
Yes, it's just that the very final paragraph of the previous chapter on romanticism and music, which seemed to me to be a happy ending, so I thought it might be good to share it.
All right.
It's about, so I'm just going to read the last couple of sentences. Chopin had lapsed from his Catholic faith, but James Huneker, in his biography of Chopin, recalls the eyewitness account by Father Alexander Jelewiski of the composer's deathbed reconversion to his Catholic faith. Father Jelewiski, a longtime friend, was able to cooperate with grace and bring the last rites to Chopin, who ultimately received the grace to accept them. So, regardless of the fact that he wandered and however we want to talk about that, it's always good to see someone being reconciled with Holy Mother Church before crossing the threshold.
And it is, yes, I found it interesting that so many of these great composers are quite devout, either Catholics or Protestants, and even some who, in the earlier years seem to be, womanizers, I would call them. I mean, they end up, becoming ordained, deacons or whatever. It's pretty amazing.
Notice how the surname of the priest is Polish, and sometimes people forget that Chopin was actually from Poland.
That's right. Yeah.
Who had family had emigrated and ended up in France, but so he kind of ended up going home in a way, receiving the last rites from a Polish priest. That was during the time when there wasn't a Poland, it had been divided three ways between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So,
which is actually almost the norm in Polish history, unfortunately. The next thing I have, and I'm happy to cede the floor to others, is page 152 in the next chapter.
So this is Romantic Italian Opera, where they say that Mozart is nothing in Italy and Rossini everything.
Isn't that hard to imagine? Remember we were talking about how Bach fell out of fashion?
Yes.
And now we see Mozart falling out of fashion. And what I had fun with this chapter is circling all the operas I've seen live on the stage in San Francisco, because I've seen a lot of these. And I love opera myself. I know not everybody likes it. There's a huge difference. I just want to tell people between listening to it on the radio. I could never do that. You have to watch it. It's a spectacle. It's a multi-sensory experience. You have to both be able to see it, watch it, and hear it. And so,
especially if you're listening to it in the original language, such as, for instance, Italian. If you don't speak Italian, then at least if you're watching it, you can sort of follow the action up to a point because of what's happening on the stage. But if you're just listening to it, you only have the words. You literally only have the music.
But at least in our opera house, which is wonderful, they do have up on the top there. They have the translation, so you can actually see it as you're listening and watching.
Yes, that's helpful too. So the Rossini's operas, Barbara of Seville, La Cenerentola, that's the Cinderella. These were just blockbuster successes in Italy in his time, and they still are. These operas make up the major repertoire of opera houses throughout the world even now.
Yeah, but what I found very interesting, Vivian, and I agree with you, and I've obviously seen those the smash hits. But obviously, as someone who's done quite a bit of work on Tudor and Stuart England with my work on Shakespeare and others, what I found very interesting is the fact that Rossini composed operas on that period of history, the Tudor period. So, I mean, my Italian is horrible, but I can understand. Elisabetta Regina d'Inghilterra is Queen Elizabeth of England.
Yes.
Elisabetta al Castello di Kenilworth is Elizabeth at Kenilworth Castle. And then Anna Boleyn and Maria Stuarda is obviously Anne Boleyn and Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots. And Roberto Devereux is obviously Robert Devereux. So, and then we have Rossini taking inspiration from Sir Walter Scott's narrative poem, The Lady of the Lake. I found it very, very interesting that that English history was such an inspiration to 19th century Italian opera composers.
Well, remember when we were talking about what book was that we were talking about the romanticization of this drama of the Tudors in poetry, in literature. And so this is the Romantic era, right? So it shows you that these artistic movements are going throughout Europe. You know, the Romantic storytelling of what's going on in England gets spread to the continent. Now they base operas on these stories. So I too was fascinated. I've seen Roberto Devereux on the stage, and it is funny to see all these people in Tudor costumes singing in Italian. You know, it's really funny.
Elizabeth I singing in Italian. I mean, it sounds almost Monty Python-esque.
It is. It is almost Monty Python-esque. There's times when you want to burst out laughing, even when it's not supposed to be a funny scene. You know, it is sort of Monty Python. But that's really a curious thing that this, because of the Romantic poetry, these stories captured people's imaginations, whether it was the real Mary Stuart or not. Right.
Romanticized version. And I see Bellini further down here actually composed an opera called The Puritans in 1835 that involves a conflict during the English Civil War between the Puritan Parliament and the Royalists.
Yes, I'm sure the Puritans came out looking badly. I mean, I don't see how the Italians could possibly stand the Puritans. Also, I've seen Norma also at San Francisco Opera House, and that's about a Druid priestess who, which that's so interesting because too, also in this period, right? Isn't there a kind of interest in sort of pagan legends and mythology and things like that? You see that in Wagner's operas, you know. So that too is interesting. Where they're getting their inspiration from is so interesting.
But I'm wondering.
Sorry, Father.
Do you think? I'm thinking back to the 18th, 19th centuries. Germany was not really a country at the time. You know, it was a bunch of different duchies and so on, and neither was it Italy. I mean, there was no king in Italy. You had the Kingdom of Naples and Kingdom of Sicily and so on. But I mean, England had a long history of a country with a kind of a common culture and a common people and a monarch. That now, of course, you had it in France, I suppose, too. But maybe one of the reasons they looked to England for the drama is that you had actually a country, but you didn't have that in Italy.
They're more interested, Father, I'm sorry to say, in the torrid love affairs.
Sure.
These operas have more to do with the torrid love affairs going on than they do with, and then the political intrigue that goes hand in hand with this kind of. But
wait a minute. Are you saying there are more torrid love affairs in England than in Italy?
No, but they got romanticized in poetry and novels and things like that, and that because these operas have very little to do with politics and much more to do with love affairs gone badly.
So, Father, are you saying that there's no such thing as an English lover?
No, I'm saying torrid love affairs.
Yeah.
We will not be outdone by the British.
In fact, I have to say that the characterization of Queen Elizabeth in Roberto Devereux, I mean, she's painted as just a an emotional, hysterical, jealous,
Shrewd.
That sounds pretty much like the real thing, from my understanding of her.
And very possibly so. But I'm saying that's, that's where the drama's coming from, these lovers' quarrels. And now I have to say, though, when we get to Verdi, his romances, and Puccini too, their romances take on another level of poignancy because, like for example, Verdi's La Traviata, you have the love affair between the courtesan and the young man, who isn't permitted, of course, to marry her, but takes her as a mistress against his, and she gets tuberculosis, and there's this incredible reconciliation that happens by the end of the opera where there's all this repentance and sorrow, and he's reconciled to his father. She gives up she knows she's dying, and it's amazing that while the love affairs are the plot, the plot is following the trajectory of these affairs. In these operas by Verdi and Puccini, there's something else going on. There's the state of the soul that is being looked at. And same thing with La Boheme. And so, you leave these places crying. I do anyway. And
I love Verdi and I love Puccini, and Verdi's Otello and it's wonderful. And the Ave Maria in it's one of my favorite pieces of music. But it is interesting here in page 153 how Susan Treacy points out that Verdi's was also great sympathy for the Risorgimento, the Italian nationalism, which was very Freemasonic and anti-Catholic, and she says here towards the bottom of page 153 that his famous Chorus of the Hebrew Slaves, one of the most famous pieces of opera music from Nabucco, has alluded to the ideals of the Risorgimento. So there's an anti-Catholic element which I had no idea of before.
Well, there were Catholics, though, who wanted Italian unification just to stop all the warfare and for example, who's the great Catholic novelist of this same period? Manzoni.
Manzoni, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't like just labeling people, well, that's Masonic, and that's this, and that's anti-Catholic, and that's that, because I think sometimes these things are rather complicated, and you can have different people wanting similar changes in a society, even though they
I agree completely that things can be complicated, Vivian. I mean, let's look at the Spanish Civil War, where there are many Catholics in the Basque region that fought with the communists and the anarchists because they wanted independence for the Basque country. So I'm aware that things are complicated, but nonetheless, we do have to also see the tree, the woods as well as the trees. In other words, don't be blinded by the detail. And we can say that the French Revolution was mainly a secular humanist, anti-Catholic revolution.
Right.
And I do think it's fair to say that the Risorgimento was largely Masonic in inspiration and largely anti-Catholic inspiration. It doesn't mean that people might, for other reasons, side with it.
Well, and I mean, now having the perspective of history, is it such a bad thing that the church lost the Papal States and lost her temporal power? Was that?
Well, I agree completely. I don't necessarily think it's a good thing to have big nation states that then cause world wars a few decades later.
No, of course not. I'm just saying that.
But it is certainly true that God does paint straight with crooked lines. I mean, the French Revolution was absolutely crucial to the revival of Catholicism in England.
Yeah, well, that's sort of a
not only were there
point.
tens of thousands of French emigres coming to England, but the English aristocracy became pro-Catholic overnight because they were opposed to the revolution.
Right, but I'm not talking about a good outcome out of a bad situation. What I'm talking about is a movement like the Italian movement to strip the church of her temporal power, unify the country, and so on. you didn't necessarily have to be an anti-Catholic to want the same outcome as maybe an anti-Catholic Freemason. Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm just talking about the Italian situation here, how you could have people with very different reasons for wanting to change the situation. And that's all.
Yeah.
Well, again, history is complicated because to a lesser extent, you could say that about the French Revolution as well. I mean, and the Enlightenment. And Pope Benedict, Ratzinger has kind of defended certain aspects of the Enlightenment and even the Revolution, while obviously condemning the total anti-Catholic, persecutions going on.
He even says that there's two enlightenments. The one that is inspired because of Christianity and the gospel, and the one that's the anti-Christianity. And so it takes a little bit of discernment to weed them out from one another,
So that's romantic Italian opera we're talking about, more or less. But anything more we want to say about Verdi or, Puccini or any of these people?
No, I'm happy to move on. Not
Let's move on to Liszt, Liszt, because he added a Z to it for some reason, and Wagner. All right.
Well, I'm happy to let one of you two talk about Liszt, and I'd like to just say something about Wagner.
There's only one of us that possibly could.
Right. Well,
Liszt comes first chronologically and in the book, and therefore we should talk about him first.
Right. Well, my mother, who was a classical pianist, Liszt was one of her favorite composers because she was a solo recitalist. And he, interestingly enough, is the one who invented the solo piano recital. That's on page 160. I did not know that. And so, yes, he's the one Father alluded to. He tried to become a priest, and yet hordes of adoring female fans. He was a womanizer, but there was this back and forth with being attracted to the church and so on. He had, and one of his daughters from one of his liaisons actually married Wagner. I know you said, Joseph, you wanted to talk about Wagner. Unfortunately, Wagner was a very cruel husband to Cosima, from what I understand, and his other marriages and relationships and whatnot were not pretty. But in any case, Liszt did all these very innovative things with the piano. Chopin too.
I also mentioned there. You mentioned the solo piano solo virtuoso, but also the symphonic poem, which is a form of music I'm particularly fond of. He seems to have been the originator of that, the innovator of the symphonic poem, as well as the solo piano recitals. So yeah, Liszt. I love Liszt. Don't get me wrong. It's just that I didn't really have much to say, and I thought that you might.
Right. Well, this paragraph right here on page 160 at the bottom, Liszt's flamboyant lifestyle sometimes obscured his true musical contributions, because he really was an innovator, just as it obscured his deep Catholic faith. So, the artists are very complicated people. I know. I have a family with several colorful characters.
You got a son. You got a son who's an artist.
I have a son who's an artist. My mother was a musician. Yeah. Okay. I'm just saying.
Yeah. Well, what I would say about Wagner, he was not unlike Liszt. Was obviously not a cradle Catholic and was very anti-Catholic. I'm certainly not trying to canonize him, and I'm certainly not interested in defending him as a good father, a good husband. But he's a brilliant composer. He's probably my favorite composer.
Really?
Yeah, I love Wagner. He's just, yeah.
What's amazing about Wagner, Joseph, he didn't even begin his musical training until he was like in his early 20s. That alone, you realize the genius of the man, that he could start at that stage in life and end up producing what he did.
What I love about him, obviously he was idolized by Nietzsche because of his anti-Catholicism and anti-Christianity and his sort of aesthetic paganism. maybe quasi-German nationalism. But what's very interesting is Wagner's final opera was Parsifal, which is the only opera he ever wrote that was on a principally Christian subject. Parsifal, as in Percival of the Arthurian legends, Knights of the Round Table. And although I think it's an absolutely wonderful opera, but it's very quirky and ultimately, to be honest, heterodox. But it's also Christian friendly, and amazingly so for Wagner. It is nothing anti-Christian, it's just quirky. And so much so that Nietzsche actually broke off his relationship, as Susan Treacy mentions here, with Wagner, for the fact that Wagner basically was flirting with Christianity. And then the end of the chapter, we have this again relatively happy ending, bearing in mind what a miserable life he led from the perspective of the church.
Yeah.
As he neared the end of his life, he wrote to his patron, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, quote, "It seems to me as if the making of this work," in other words, Parsifal, "has been entrusted to me in order to uphold to the world its own most profound mystery, the truth of the Christian faith. Indeed, even to rekindle this faith." So even someone who was such an enemy of Christianity throughout most of his life, at the end seemed to be reconciling himself with it. And I think that is a source and a cause for joy, irrespective of whether he ever got far enough to be received into the church.
By the way, I also want to give credit to Wagner for, if I hum this, do, 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 do. What's that from, Joseph? Star Wars. You ever seen? Okay.
I should have got my sister, because I should have got my daughter in here. She would have got it immediately.
Okay, so that's the leitmotif of which character?
Vader.
Can't remember which character. Okay. Wagner is the one who made this into an art form, giving each character a leitmotif, so that as soon as you hear that melody, you know instantly, aha, Siegfried is going to enter stage right, or Brunhilde is going to enter stage left, or whatever. Each character, she mentions this on 161, and this has been used in cinema by the really great movie makers ever since. What Wagner developed for stage production ended up being adopted for cinema. And not all movie makers do this, but some of the really great ones do.
I mean, the beautiful music, my favorite film music of all, but then I'm biased, I know, is Howard Shore's music for Lord of the Rings.
Oh, same thing.
Yeah, and again, that would have been impossible and unthinkable without Wagner. Without Wagner, there would be no Howard Shore.
No, that's absolutely right. These some of the cinema makers who do these kinds of scores with these very strong leitmotifs, so you immediately know, oh, we're in Hobbiton now. Oh, this is the theme for the horse people.
The Dark Riders, yeah, right.
Yeah, and by the time you've seen it and you leave the theater, it's in your brain. Who is what and yeah, we have Wagner to thank for that, really.
Yes.
Well, I'm learning a lot, I will tell you that. I may even start trying to listen and watch some of these things. But let's move on to chapter 21, Central European Romantics and Post-Romantics.
Yeah, again, I mean, I want to point out another one of my favorite composers, probably because he's influenced by Wagner, is Anton Bruckner. And on page 166, we're told that Bruckner was exposed to Wagner's music, especially he was at the premiere, in the Linz premiere of Tannhäuser. And the Tannhäuser Overture is probably my favorite piece of classical music, bar none. It's just absolutely beautiful. And he says here, having listened to Wagner, Bruckner's profoundly Catholic, right? A very deeply Catholic composer. Now Bruckner had courage to reveal the music that had been inside him for so long. The revelation of his mature style came in 1864 with his Mass in D minor. So here we see this unlikely connection between Wagner's Tannhäuser opera and Bruckner's Mass in D minor, where Bruckner, now, I know certainly liturgists, I mean, good solid traditional liturgists that don't like Bruckner as a liturgical composer, because yes, the music's not suitable for the liturgy, right? It's just too big for the liturgy. It's not liturgical music, but it's the setting of the Mass. So it's still sacred music, and really beautiful sacred music.
Right, he has a beautiful Magnificat and other things. Also, I want to say about Tannhäuser by Wagner, that too has a pretty strong Christian element in the sense that the main character is being pulled between erotic love and purified love, right? And that is the tension of the whole thing. And so, and like you say,
and he goes to Rome at some point as well.
Yes, he goes to Rome as a pilgrim.
Yeah,
and then comes back because he whoever he messed around with or whatever, his punishment was to go to Rome as a pilgrim. And when he comes back, I think there's an appearance by the Virgin Mary. Even I think
it's a bit of sort of an ambivalent loose ends, which is typically Wagner at the end.
Right.
It doesn't end neatly and tidily, but no. Yes, all the elements are there. Absolutely.
But the tension is there. The tension between a pagan, purely erotic view of love and a purified Christian love. And this is the tension of Tannhäuser. And so the fact that that is the opera that inspired Bruckner, I find a curious thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you say in the middle of page 167, he already alluded to his Magnificat, but he says, though Bruckner is known primarily as a symphonic composer, his sacred music deserves to be better known.
Yes.
Bruckner's Catholic faith shines forth in his liturgical music, from the sublime motets Ave Maria and O Justi to his larger sacred choral works. Bruckner's masses and his Te Deum are like vocal symphonies, or as some have commented, his symphonies are rather like masses without words.
Yes, I'm surprised she didn't mention his Magnificat, but that belongs on that list too. So you want to move on to Brahms?
Absolutely, yeah,
sure.
please.
I love this.
Brahms is for you.
I love this quote on 168 where Brahms complains, quote, "You don't know what it feels like to have a giant like Beethoven dogging your footsteps." These guys are feeling the pressure, right? They've got to live up to the standard bearers.
He was unable to finish a work for ages because he thought, well, it's just not as good as Beethoven.
Yep.
But they say, and I don't know much about this, but they say basically that you're either a Brahms person or a Wagner person, and they're two different approaches. And I love both, but to me, Wagner has that something, that je ne sais quoi. That Brahms is too smooth for me. There's not the edge. There's not the innovation.
And then Dvorak. Here's another faithful Catholic man. And, probably most people are more familiar with his New World Symphony, which he composed here in the U.S. But he also, his Slavonic dances are also famous. But what's interesting to me about Dvorak is his, on page 170, that quote from the bottom, where he talks about the Black spirituals in America being a rich source for future music creation, because he was dipping into his cultural heritage. And the fact that he pinpointed that, because that's exactly what happened in the period after him. You think of like Copland's music or jazz or, Gershwin. Right. So it's just interesting. He was kind of prophetic in this sense of pinpointing, there is a unique cultural thing here in America, and it's worth tapping as a source of inspiration for composition.
What's interesting, and we don't have time to talk about it now, and it's absolutely a tangent, but the should we say the Caucasian threads in the United States are European threads, right? So Appalachian music is sort of basically Celtic music.
Right.
So, that it's rooted somewhere further back than the United States. And although the music of the slaves obviously has some sort of roots in Africa, there is something, and that's lost, all right? There's something basically which is unique to the United States in the music that the black slaves bring to the culture, whereas the bluegrass music is just a variation or a development from the Celtic music of Scotland and Ireland.
Well, I'm impressed that we have a great composer who lived a lot of his life in Spillville, Iowa. I mean, what good can come from Spillville, one might ask. So good. You want to go to Mahler, or?
It depends whether you want to go beyond the 30 minutes. I'm happy to, but we are.
Well, let's finish this chapter anyway.
Yeah, that's good.
That chapter. I have nothing else to say on that chapter anyway. So that's down to Vivian.
The chapter.
I'm ready for the Russians, but it's just whether the Russians should be next time.
And I have to say, I know nothing about Mahler, and she gives just a very small little tidbit about him here. And let me shut that off. And but our current symphony composer here, Michael Tilson Thomas, is a Mahler expert, and he puts on all kinds of. He's done.
I do like Mahler. I think that Mahler's a little bit over the top. He's sort of Bruckner and Wagner on something, or on speed or something. But his Resurrection Symphony, which is not very orthodox, is nonetheless, I think, very beautiful. So I like Mahler as well. But that's all.
Well, I know, really about others we've talked to, next to nothing. But I do know this, that Hans Urs and Balthasar had a great appreciation for Mahler. Love to listen to Mahler.
Yeah, no, he's an absolutely great composer. He seems that he takes the Wagnerian elements of Wagner himself and Bruckner and just goes that one step further. That's the impression I get about Mahler.
Well, next time they have him on the repertoire. You could start
arguing at that point that it's too much, but that's, I suppose, a question of aesthetic sensibility, right?
Well, next time they have him on the repertoire at the symphony, I'm going to go, because my son bought me tickets for Christmas. I'm just waiting for COVID to pass so I can go cash in.
Oh, very good. Wonderful. So we'll continue next week, God willing, with chapter 22, The Russians. 19th century. Thanks for listening and watching. God bless you all from the Formed Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.